It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to have Nikolas Rose to give us a lecture this afternoon. I know we're all eager to listen to him and not to me giving an introduction. You'll just allow me to talk for about 5 minutes to tell you where you are and who we are. There are 4 institutes for advanced studies in France: Marseille, Nantes, Lyon, and Paris. These institutes were created in order to strengthen the humanities and social sciences in France, to internationalize them, and to create interdisciplinarity. The one in Paris was created for 7 years ago, but moved into this wonderful building, 17th century, dedicated by the city of Paris to the Institute for Advanced Studies and supported by 12 universities in the Paris area. Although the principal mission of the Institutes for Advanced Studies is the promotion of the humanities and the social sciences, each institute has some kind of specificity. Marseille is about the Mediterranean, Nantes is about the dialogue between North and South, and the one in Paris, we have chosen to give it the specificity of being the dialogue between the humanities, social sciences, and the neurosciences. Why? For 2 obvious reasons. One of them is that the problem, the body-mind problem, is at the basis of philosophy from the beginning of ages. It is not only the question of the relationship between the material and the immaterial, it also involves in itself the question of causality, and it also involves in it the question of normality. So if we're talking about being human, the question of body-mind is at the very center of what it means to be human. The second reason is more personal. I was very much involved in the creation of the European Research Council, the so-called ERC. And I chaired a panel from 2007 to 2013 on the human mind and brain. And I have literally seen hundreds of applications from the best researchers in Europe trying to do research on the human mind and the human brain. There were one part of the applicants trying to find the crooked molecule behind the crooked thought without any clue about what that thought might be, or maybe trying to find the neural correlates of identity without ever describing what identity meant and could be, as if it were an object, a measurable object. And on the other side, we had philosophers applying for research on consciousness without knowing anything of what went on in the neurosciences for the last 10 years. It's not because they were stupid. It's because it is extremely difficult to do interdisciplinary research. And we don't have any delusions of grandeur here. We don't think that we are the only ones trying to do that, or that we will necessarily succeed. If you have seen Nature from September, it says sort of pompously, interdisciplinarity, why scientists must work together to save the world. Not sure we will be able to, but this is an attempt on our part to do that. Why we cannot talk together is because, to put it very bluntly, you'll excuse me, but things will be more nuanced where you take over. The neuroscientists don't listen to us. They may talk together with us and exchange and we feel that we are in a dialogue, but a year after, when they come back, it has had no impact. On the other side, when we humanists and social scientists talk with neuroscientists, we are afraid, we worry, we are afraid that they are reducing reality, and we have a knowledge of what has happened throughout history and what it has meant to have reductions of what it means to be human to biological and physical characteristics. What we're trying to do here is to try and reduce the incomprehension on both sides. Nikolas Rose today, our speaker, sociologist, social theorist, currently head of Department of King's College London, Department of Social Sciences and Health, earlier professor of sociology at the London School of Economics, Goldsmiths College, originally trained as a biologist, done extensive work on the history and sociology of psychiatry, mental health, the concept of risk, pharmacology, and more recently, the author, together with Abi Rashed, on neuro, the new brain sciences, and the management of the mind. So thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to this wonderful institute, and thanks to everybody for coming this afternoon. So my talk is rather pretentiously called Beyond the Mind-Brain Problem, ? The social implications of contemporary neuroscience. And I should start with a word of warning. It's not a philosophical talk. It's a talk in the area of historical ontology, which those of you who know Michel Foucault's work will know he calls a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as certain kinds of subjects. So with that word of warning, let me begin. Let me begin with something that happens. This little chart here just shows you the growth of papers, research papers published in the area of neuroscience since 1958. You'll see that if something happens, it happens quite slowly, and then it happens with a huge increase till around 2014. And around 2014, there are over 100,000 peer-reviewed papers published every year in the area broadly defined as neuroscience, which made it rather challenging when Joël, Abi Rashed, and I were trying to do our genealogy of contemporary neuroscience. Now, in 1950, when the BBC was the kind of program that had a series introduced by eminent neuroscientists, Charles Sherrington introduced a series on the radio about the nature of mind. And in his introduction to the very first program of that, he said he reflected back to a talk that he'd given back in 1900. And in 1900, he said, we have to regard the relationship of mind to brain as still not merely unsolved, but devoid of a very basis for its beginning. And in 1950, in the talk that he gave in this series, he says Aristotle, 2,000 years ago, was asking how the mind is attached to the body. We're asking that question still. 12 years after Sherrington gave that introduction to his series on the radio, Francis O. Schmidt at MIT coined the word neuroscience. It slips so easily off the tongue now that we don't realize that it was a radical attempt inspired by what had happened in molecular biology after the identification of the genetic code, inspired by that to bring together biophysicists, doctors, brain anatomists, psychiatrists, and a range of other disciplines, all of whom were concerned with the brain, to bring them together under one roof and in one project, a project which he came to call Neuroscience. And this is what he says there. There's an urgency in effectuating a quantum step in understanding the mind, not only as an academic exercise of scientific research, not only to understand mental disease, not only to create an entirely new science, but perhaps through an understanding of the mind to learn more about the nature of our own being. Some of you will know that in 1990, the decade of the brain was proclaimed. And if you look back to the original proclamation by George Bush, then President of the United States, about the decade of the brain, he not only says, well, the brain is the major challenge, the frontier, the great unknown for the sciences, but also says that in understanding the brain, we will understand those things that afflict so many of our fellow citizens, in particular, that not just psychiatric disorders, but also Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So we come rapidly to 1998. And in 1998, in a paper that was published in a human sciences journal called Daedalus, the great neuroscientist Vernon Mountcastle, who discovered the columnar organization of the cerebral cortex, wrote this: "The half-century's accumulation of the knowledge of brain function has brought us face to face with the question of what it means to be human. We make no pretension that solutions are at hand, but assert that what makes man human is his brain. Things mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains." And we know that very soon after Mountcastle wrote those words, neuroscience moved in a radical direction, not just from claiming that it could know the brain, but also claiming that it could govern through the brain, or it could govern the brain. It moved out of the laboratory and into the world. And you'll be very familiar with all these: neuropsychiatry, social neuroscience, the idea that neuroscience can affect and should underpin social policy, of course, military neuroscience, neuroeconomics, neuromarketing, neuropolitics, neuroeducation, neuro-everything. Now, in my early work, when I was something of a historian of psychology, I argued that across the 20th century, we'd seen the emergence of something that I termed the Sci Complex, the idea that ourselves as human beings were inhabited by a deep interior psychological space, which was the locus of our personhood, of our personality, of our beliefs, of our emotions. And that psi space was charted out by the disciplines that named it: intelligence, personality, trauma, repression, unconscious, and so on. And Psi was also a very generous discipline in that it gave itself away to others: teachers, social workers, probation officers, policemen, doctors, you name it, on the condition that they spoke a little bit like psychologists. Psi experts became, I argued, technicians of subjectivity. So I suppose the question which lies behind the little talk I'm going to give today is whether we've moved from that Sci Complex to what one might call a neurocomplex. If we have, how we have moved in that direction, and with what implications. How should we address the change that has come about, if one has come about? So, in the next half hour, in a very brief Cook's tour, I'm going to explore just some of the routes through which neuro left the lab and entered the world. I'm going to talk about pharmaceuticals, I'm going to talk about localization, I'm going to talk about visualization, I'm going to talk about simulation, and I'm going to talk about thought identification. And forgive me, each of these little vignettes is going to be extremely simple, perhaps oversimple. So let's start with pharmaceuticals. Of course, we have known that mental events are shaped by physical events in the brain since the invention of psychoactive drugs. and perhaps even before the invention of psychoactive drugs, in the long history of humans consuming chemicals that alter their mental states. And by the 1960s, we seem to have a hypothesis of how those mental states were altered, because these drugs, it was claimed, worked on neurotransmitters. We had a neurotransmitter theory of mental disorder, and by extension, a neurotransmitter theory of normal variations in human mood, in human thought, and in human desire. Now today, even though the hypothesis, this neurotransmitter hypothesis of mental disorder, is at very best partial, and even though many doubt the efficacy of the drugs that were built on that, the idea that we can modulate molecular neurochemistry in order to modulate mental processes is widely accepted in practice. These are just a few of the many kinds of examples of data that I could present to you about the consumption of these psychopharmaceutical drugs. You'll see here that France is not the most avid consumer of these drugs. These are OECD figures about the antidepressant consumption in 2000, which are the pale bars, and in 2011, which are the dark bars. These figures over here are the figures for the consumption of all the categories of drugs. And again, you can see the increase that's going on here. And these just to show you that that's the UK, this is Europe, and that is Australia, the consumption of antidepressants in Australia. You can see that the consumption of all these other classes of drugs on these bars down here remains pretty much constant. This rising bar here is what we call the antidepressants. Now, even though we know that this image of how those drugs work, this is from an old piece that I took from the Eli Lilly website. Eli Lilly, you will recall, the manufacturers of Prozac. This image is from Stephen Stahl's training book, Essential Psychopharmacology, that pictures these drugs as little keys that go into these locks here. These are receptor sites. That's how the drug fits into the receptor sites. These are the neurotransmitters zooming across the synaptic cleft. That's how the drugs work. And that little image, that little imaginary, is how Eli Lilly showed it to their potential consumers, even though we know that if those drugs which we call antidepressants but are actually used for a whole wide range of conditions, anxiety conditions and so on and so forth, even if those drugs work at all for mild to moderate disorders, they almost certainly don't work that way. And the claims that were so powerful when those drugs like Prozac were launched are dreams at best. But few can dispute or would dispute the fact that mental states can be modulated by molecular modulation of neurobiology, even if that's a very, very incomplete explanation of psychiatric disorders. Route 2, localization. We've had 150 years of research claiming to discover the cerebral locations of specific mental functions. And many of the early localizers, in particular those now associated with the much derided term phrenology, are regarded as enthusiasts, crazy enthusiasts who believe that they could read personality characteristics by feeling the bumps on your skull. But I think in that wish to mock these early researchers, we sometimes forget just how dangerous their radicalism was. Joseph Gall was exiled from Austria because of his dangerous materialism, even though he tried to recount God and the brain. He said famously, there is just God and the brain. God had to be in there, but the brain as well. And that's Gall, and that's Spurzheim, who, after he left Gall, went on to popularize phrenology. We deride their their phrenology, but we should remember their dangerous materialism. All these characters here, the original identifiers of the brain localization of particular speech and memory functions, were in their own way materialists. In this rather wonderful book, which I've just illustrated here by the cover, called The End of the Soul by Jennifer Michael Hecht, she charts the development of the Society for Mutual Autopsy, in which those members of the Parisian elite, the great and the good, were concerned about the fact that the only brains they had to dissect were the brains of lunatics and criminals and those executed for various offences. And they mutually agreed with one another that when one of them died, they would, all together, they would dissect their brains and see if they could understand the cerebral roots of their great intellect. Now, these attempts came to nothing. Unfortunately, size of brain, levels of folding of the cerebrum, and all that kind of thing did not correlate with the fine intellect of these individuals. It was linked with a whole history of attempts to identify brain size and to look at the different brain sizes between different races and the different brain sizes between males and females. All that we can deride. But what perhaps we can't deride is the claim that they made for the role of the brain as the seat of human nature. Of course, they weren't the only localizers. These wonderful diagrams by Wilder Penfield that I may come back to in a moment, opening up the brain of people who are suffering from very severe and intractable epilepsy and stimulating the surface of the cortex in order to identify which parts of the, trying to identify where the locus of the epileptic attack was in order to ablate it, and also discovering in the process the way in which the sensorium of the human being was mapped across the cerebral cortex in that way. These are the developments of structural brain imaging, CAT scanning, and then in the most radical movement, I think, from our point of view, the move from analysis of the brain, of imaging of the brain in terms of structure to imaging of the brain, or claims about imaging the brain in terms of function. And this is PET scanning, this is Fmri scanning. We're very, very familiar with these images today. These images, in particular, the Fmri scanning, seek to identify where thought or activity is happening in the brain by using a surrogate measure, a measure of blood oxygenation in those regions of the brain. And since the invention of Fmri, in the 31st years since the invention of Fmri, over 50,000 papers were published using that technology, and the rate of published papers is now running at around 600 papers a month using Fmri. Papers relating changes in brain activities to responses to art, responses to specific painters, composers, performers, authors, television commercials, grief after the loss of a child, love, hate, fear, and acts of choice. Now, as with the X-ray, in its early days, as some enthusiast for X-ray said, the eye seems to walk amongst the tissues of the mind itself. Now, of course, there are multiple problems with these approaches. Are brain functions localized? In what sense are they localized? The same brain region is activated by many different tasks. What kind of scale should you try and image the brain at? There are 10 to the 10 neurons, 10 to the 14 connections in the human cortex alone, and about 1 billion synapses in each voxel, each of those little voxel images that make up these pictures that you see there. And as we know now, neural circuitry is highly distributed with much redundancy. There's no modular mind, as this way of thinking seems to believe. These doctrines of strict localization are now discredited. We know that there's a huge amount of activity that happens when the brain is at rest. We've begun to map out neural circuits, very highly distributed neural circuits, and we've begun to develop new visualizing technologies that can be much more finely grained. But I guess the thought remains here. Are we not seeing material traces of thought in the brain itself?
With astonishing dexterity, a monkey reaches out to grab and turn a handle with a robotic arm controlled not by its hands, but directly by its brain. With the power of thought, it can alter the speed and direction of the arm, twisting the joints to home in on its target. It shows no signs of distress from the wires leading from electrodes in its brain to a computer. The reward for each turn of the handle, a drink of water.
So that's a monkey moving a robotic arm, not by a prosthesis attached to the residual nerves and muscles in its arm, but by a cortical implant. We'll come back to those cortical implants a little bit later on. Those of you who know this work will know that what's happening here is the monkey is imagining that it is moving. The imagination stimulates the areas in the motor cortex that would be stimulated if it was moving those muscles themselves, and it can very rapidly learn through working imagination affecting the motor cortex to then move that robotic arm. And as I say, we'll come back to that in a moment. So that's the second route, localization. Here's the third route. Well, perhaps this may be the oldest route. It's the argument that the brain creates the visible world. A century of work on vision has told us of the constitutive role of non-conscious neural processes in generating an internal illusion of the external world.
This is the hollow head. Actually, at the moment, it's a perfectly normal head of Charlie Chaplin, but wait, as it comes round, you'll see, or will you, that it's hollow. The back of it, coming round now, is actually a hollow mask. It appears to rotate in the opposite direction, and amazingly, the nose sticks out, although it's actually sticking in. Coming round now is the normal, correct, as it were, face, and wait again as it comes round, and you'll see this extraordinary thing like Jekyll and Hyde. Both the noses stick out because it's so unlikely that a nose sticks in that a face is hollow. So you see it as convex.
That's thanks to Richard Gregory, the wonderful neuroscientist working on visual illusions for that.
A classical illusion that has been published in 1998 by two Americans, Botvinnik and Cohen, two American neuroscientists, is the rubber hand illusion. The rubber hand illusion consists in placing, let's say, one's left arm out of sight, out of vision, and placing in front of the eyes of the subject a hand in plastic, a rubber hand. And then the experimenter will stroke, let's say, the index finger of my left hand, and at the same time the left index finger of the rubber hand. And if he does this synchronously for a minute, up to 2 minutes, certain subjects, 2/3 of all subjects, will start experiencing this hand for some moments as if it were belonging to their body. So this is one way, and this is normally investigated by questionnaires. So the subject will be asked a certain number of questions.
So, Olaf Blanke is very interested in the way in which humans establish an image of their own body and their own bodily identity. And some of those experiments, like the rubber hand experiment, lead him to the belief that that internal image of your identity and the coherence of your body is something that's constructed at the level of the brain. And in a rather radical version of this, the neuroscientist Chris Frith, in a rather genial book called Making Up the Mind, states this in his words like this: our perceptions of our physical world, of our body, and of our mental states are illusions made up by our brain. Or to put it differently, our perception of the world is a fantasy that coincides with reality. My perception is not of the world, but of my brain's model of the world. And Chris Frith uses many of those visual illusions, rubber hand illusions, and so on, to seek to demonstrate that the distinction between the mental and the physical is false. Everything we know, whether it's about the physical or the mental world, comes to us through our brain. By hiding from us all the unconscious inferences that it makes, our brain creates the illusion that we have direct contact with objects in the physical world and creates the illusion that our mental world is isolated and private. Through these two illusions, we experience ourselves as agents acting independently upon the world. The fourth route that might lead us to question the classical distinction between mind and brain is simulation. Now, I'm working with colleagues here in Paris and elsewhere on the what has become a rather controversial example of big science known as the Human Brain Project. Of course, there have been attempts to simulate intelligence in machines for many years, in computers, with artificial intelligence, with the emergence of the idea of the brain as a neural network. But now we are beginning to see large-scale simulations that try to create intelligent machines that try to emulate the capacities of the human brain, and that try to link those, at least in prospect, to robotics, to humanize robots with simulated brains. Now, of course, as I say, this attempt to build cybernetic brains goes back to the 1950s and the 1960s. Here are some wonderful British inventors. They did a lot with string and rubber and little motors and all those kinds of things. When I was at university in my short time as a biologist, I especially enjoyed reading Gray Walter here, William Gray Walter's lovely book called The Living Brain. Some of this is historicized in intriguing detail in this book, The Cybernetic Brain, by Andrew Pickering. They were British eccentrics, and they certainly weren't funded to the tune of 1.3 billion euros, as is the Human Brain Project. Nonetheless, as this Human Brain Project has come into existence, a number of people, not just in the Human Brain Project, but elsewhere, and many, of course, imaginary science fiction movies have tried to imagine whether it is possible to build a human brain or something like a human brain in some kind of artificial element. This is a little piece here about the Human Brain Project. This is Christoph Koch, who, if we have a moment, we might come to later on, who is the Chief Scientific Officer of the Allen Brain Institute, Allen Institute for Brain Sciences, I beg its pardon, in Seattle. And he's talking actually about these movies. Christoph Koch worked with Francis Crick in the last period of Francis Crick's life. This is what he says, talking about these movies. I have little doubt about the essential scientific veracity of these movies. Within this century, we'll create artifacts that will behave to all intents and purposes as if they too shared the gift of conscious experience with us. They will pass the Turing test. Blessing or curse, only time will tell.
100 billion neurons connected by 100,000 billion synapses. The human brain is the most complex machine we know of, and the most mysterious one.
We face huge issues in neuroscience to understand how the pieces of the brain fit and work together. We face huge issues in medicine to understand how to objectively diagnose and treat brain diseases.
This is a big, big challenge. It'll have an enormous impact on the health of the aged.
European researchers propose a radically new approach to study the human mind. Their idea is simple: to simulate a complete human brain in a supercomputer.
We have a giant intellectual problem to solve here.
As a scientist, I mean, it's really the central project for brain science.
And that could revolutionize computing the way we do it today.
So the Human Brain Project, which was a continuation in many ways of an earlier project led by Henry Markram, the first person you saw speaking on that little video, the Blue Brain Project at the EPFL in Lausanne in Switzerland, is an attempt to model the human brain, starting from its very basic elements, the neurons, the nerve cells, characterizing each possible type of neuron, characterizing its biophysical properties, its membranes, its shapes, the connections it makes with other neurons, and building these in a simulation in a supercomputer. Actually, the first mega paper from the Human Brain Project was just published about 2 weeks ago in Cell. That's a little image from it. You saw Henry Markram standing behind it. And what the researchers claim is that when they do this, they simulate all the 55 types of neuron and all the kinds of connections between them in a little microcircuit, a tiny little microcircuit. When they simulate those in their supercomputer, what happens is that these circuits in the supercomputer start behaving, start pulsing, start moving their frequency oscillations around in exactly the same way as the natural circuits do within the rat's brain. Now, these projects have been very much criticized. Some say it's an impossibility because you're trying to build the tiniest little circuits. How are you going to build that up to the 10 to the 10th neurons making 10 to the 14 connections? It's going to take you a lifetime. Others say that this attempt to start with the very, very basic elements, the nerve cells, without adding in the anatomy of the brain, without adding in the blood cells, without adding in the glia, without understanding anything about the functional properties of the brain, is doomed to failure. Others say that even if you do begin to make this simulation of the brain, you will, as in the famous story by Borges, you will create a map which is as big, if not bigger, than the world itself. Nonetheless, something is happening here. The simulation of brains, and in particular the implanting of these brains into body forms, in this particular case, implanting a model of a worm's brain into a little robot here. In other cases, trying to develop much more developed brain circuits and implant them into humanized kinds of robots. Something is happening here which seems to suggest that many of the characteristics of living organisms can be recreated by implanting a simulated brain into a simulated body. Perhaps the most challenging of all these routes is the one that I've left till last, thought identification. Now, 7 or 8 years ago now, this article appeared in the Guardian newspaper, "The Brain Scan That Can Read People's Intentions." A team of neuroscientists led by John Dylan Haynes developed a technique which seemed to allow them to look into a person's brains and read their intentions before they act. And this is what John Dylan Haynes said. Using the scanner, we could look around the brain for this information and read something that from outside there's no way you could possibly tell is in there. It's like shining a torch around looking for writing on the wall. What they did was they predicted whether or not an individual was going to choose to add or subtract a certain series of numbers, and they were able to predict that by looking at the brain areas that were activated. This caused quite a bit of controversy. A colleague of mine who works on neuroethics in the Human Brain Project, Barbara Sahakian, said, "Do we want to become a minority report society where we're preventing crimes that might not happen? For some of these techniques, it's just a matter of time." Well, time, 7 years later, this appeared on the BBC website. What are you looking at? Scientist Jack Gallant can find out by decoding your thoughts. I built a brain decoder. Now, what might a brain decoder look like?
Those biomarkers and our capacity to measure them leads us naturally to Jennifer Aniston.
If we could have the next video. So we have very rarely the occasion to measure the response of the brain at the level of individual nerve cells, because for obvious reasons you can't access the nerve cells in a human brain. We can only do it by and large in experimental animals. But sometimes, particularly during neurosurgery, you can actually listen to individual neurons. Now, inside the brain, it's silent, right? There's no sound. But if you put in a microelectrode, and you can listen to the individual nerve cells chat to each other, you can hear, in fact, I think we have a recording, they have the sort of staccato sound. If you take the electrical signal and amplify it and put it on a sound speaker, you can actually hear them talk to each other. Each one is a little, each tick is a little action potential, it's a little pulse. So this is actually a recording from a surgical measurement where the neurosurgeon put a microelectrode into the brain of a patient, and this nerve cell responded very selectively only to pictures of Jennifer Aniston.
I think it's fair to say Team Angelina.
It is true. It is true. It was because, why Jennifer Aniston? It's not that we're born with Jennifer Aniston neurons, at least hopefully.
So the search for the mysterious engram, the place in the brain where a memory is encoded, has been going on for decades, always failing. But what's claimed now by Christoph Koch and others is that it is possible to identify the precise place in the brain, the precise nerve cell that will respond to the name Jennifer Aniston, to a picture of Jennifer Aniston, to a movie that Jennifer Aniston is in, and by extension, the name of your grandmother, the picture of your grandmother, the room, a picture of the room that your grandmother is in. Is it possible then to identify thought in the neurons of the brain themselves, in the nerve cells themselves? Is thought something that happens not in some ineffable mental space, but in the brain? So I won't show you these movies because I'm sure you're getting very bored with all my little movies. So this is something, actually, the movie was on American TV. It's about the work by Marcel Just and Tom Mitchell at Carnegie. And they did some experiments where they asked subjects, they were using fMRI here, actually, which is a very gross kind of measure of brain activity. They asked subjects to think of one or two things, to either think of igloo or to think of screwdriver. They looked at the fMRI, and on the basis of the fMRI, in real time, they claimed to be able to identify whether or not the subject was thinking of igloo or whether it was thinking of screwdriver. It wasn't just one place in the brain, it was a pattern of distributed activity in the brain which led them to believe that they could read out from the brain what the subject was thinking. All right, in a very simple way, very simple binary choice. Here are some other experiments. Again, I won't show you these movies. This, again, is the work of Jack Gallant at Berkeley with Shinji Nishimoto. They claim to be able to reconstruct movies using only the results from brain imaging, using, again, a modified version of that fMRI technique that I mentioned earlier, the bold response. And what they claimed to be able, and this was quite difficult for them to do, it has to be said, was to reconstruct what the person was seeing, in this case, that image there, reconstruct that by using a complex algorithm and some machine learning on the signals that were coming out from the brain itself. This is the way in which some of this work has been recorded. Mind-boggling. Science creates computers that can decode your thoughts and put them into words. Mind-reading device could become reality, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, these were extremely difficult pieces of work to do, and this is another experiment using the same kind of thing, trying to recreate words from patterns of activity in the brain. This was a piece of work which was done on individuals who were undergoing surgery for brain tumors. They had 256 electrodes put onto their brain surface as they listened to people saying individual words, and the computer program tried to analyze from the electrical activity in the surface of the cortex itself, what words they were hearing. It was very difficult to do. Only 47 words were recognized in this whole process. But nonetheless, it seemed to imply that a word was recognizable in a very specific pattern of brain activity. Now, of course, these technologies have their first mode of application in relation to locked-in patients or people with persistent vegetative states. And there have been some well-publicized experiments that seem to show that many people who are diagnosed with PVS or with locked-in syndrome are in fact able to respond to questions from outside by activating different parts of their brain. Typically, they are asked to say, if you think yes, imagine yourself playing tennis. If you think no, imagine yourself walking through the house. The brain imager can pick up the different areas of the brain that are activated, so they can say yes or no using their brain itself. In this case, a vegetative patient is argued to have said, I'm not in pain. And, of course, these are classically dual-use technologies. The European Brain project that I'm involved in has made a point of saying that it won't take any funding from military sources of funding and won't allow, as far as it can prevent it, its work to be used for military purposes. The same is not true in the United States. The US Brain Project is funded 40% by DARPA, the Defense and Allied Research Projects Agency. And of course, DARPA is extremely interested in mind control. It's working on these technologies to read brains in real time. It's developing implants that can both read out and read into the brain. Some of you, those of you who tour the furthest reaches of the internet may have come across Jose Delgado and his famous stimoceiver that he created back in the 1960s. Again, work which was largely funded by the US military. Actually, he became interested in doing these kinds of work to actually implant into the cortex of animals numerous electrodes and then use those not only to read out the patterns of brain activation, but to read back in order to control their emotions. That was work that was funded by the by the US military. He started doing that work because he thought that lobotomies were extremely crude ways of intervening into the brain. He had the misfortune of calling the book that he wrote Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, which was probably not the most adept choice of words, and that created such a great furore that he retired from the field. But nonetheless, these attempts both to read out of the brain and read into the brain are moving from science fiction to science reality. The Brazilian neuroscientist Miguel Nicolelis has done some either remarkable or disturbing work along these lines, which you can actually see if you visit the DARPA website, which I won't do right now. So many object to using the term mind reading to talk about these technologies and prefer the words thought identification. But these are technologies for identifying, accessing, using mental events by accessing physical traces in the brain. Not just generic types of activity, but specific thoughts, specific imaginations of mental objects, or specific intentions. They're slightly different from the monkey that I showed you earlier on, because the monkey that I showed you earlier on transmitted the monkey's intentions to move through the motor cortex. These are not going through the motor cortex. They are trying to identify the places in the brain itself where those imaginations are taking place. Clearly, they're in their infancy, but something is happening. As I say, they're dual-use technologies. They emerge at the intersection of both the clinical and the security apparatus. Clearly, they raise many social and ethical dilemmas. But what's happening here to our understanding of human beings themselves? Have we moved beyond the mind-brain problem? Or are we at least at the beginning of a move beyond the mind-brain problem? I think something is happening here. I think something is happening in which that deep psychological space that opened up across the 20th century is being transformed, and that selves are now conceived of as inhabited by a deep neural space, largely below the level of consciousness, only partially under conscious control, a neural space which generates the possibility of mental states, a neural space most of whose activities are not available to consciousness. And there is a kind of premise here. As I said right at the very beginning, in that quote from Vernon Mountcastle, things mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains. We've moved beyond dualism in this way of thinking. Mind is what brain does, and we're starting to draw a new kind of map of what it is to be a human being, a molecularization of thought itself, not achieved by resolution of those old philosophical dilemmas which were mentioned right at the very beginning, but seemingly achieved by technology. Now, of course, the humanist response to this is to say that it's absurd to say a brain can think, a brain can feel, a brain can know. Only persons in relation to language, to culture, to meaning, etc., can think, can know. The brain no more knows than a dictionary knows. But that argument that we have to suppose a mental realm that's different in substance or different in extension from the brain seems to me to have been outflanked. Not overcome, not resolved, but outflanked by technology. A lot of people from the human sciences get extremely worried about this idea that a huge amount of what makes our lives in this world possible happens below the level of consciousness. Surely we're agents, we're free, we're in control. But of course, as psychoanalysis taught us a long time ago, the ego is not master in its own house, and it's a fantasy to believe that it is. And here are just some quotes from Rimbaud. It's wrong to say, I think. One ought to say, I am thought, homme pense. It's a falsification of the facts to say the subject, I, moi, is the condition of the predicate think. It thinks, but that this it is precisely that famous old I, put it mildly, only an assumption. And many of you will have read this quotation from Sigmund Freud. Human megalomania will have suffered its third and most wounding blow from the research of the present time, which seeks to prove to the ego that it's not even master in its own house, but must content itself with scanty information of what's going on unconsciously in its mind. We, psychoanalysts, Freud says, but perhaps we neuroscientists were not the first to utter this call, but it seems to be our fate to give it its most forcible expression and to support it with empirical material which affects every individual. So I suppose the challenge, and I think it is a challenge, is whether or not we can formulate a new materialism, one that doesn't deride those attempts to think God and the brain, just God and the brain, but which tries to think about persons in a new way, which avoids the challenges of reductionism, which we know so well, avoids the challenge of biologism, of fatalism and so on, which had such a miserable history across the 20th century, but which nonetheless does not console ourselves, does not console us with the repetition of the humanist mantra, there must be something other than the brain. If we're witnessing such a mutation in our ontology, what might the implications be for our ethics, for the way in which we manage ourselves, for the way in which we're governed by others? I don't claim to understand very much of the writings of Gilles Deleuze. I'm ashamed to say here in Paris, but there's a little phrase from Deleuze which he talks about in relation to cinema, and he also talks about in his writings on the brain. Le cerveau, c'est l'écran. The brain is the screen. And Deleuze, in his elliptical and hard to understand way, was trying to feel his way towards a way of thinking that did not repeat the idea that there was a mental realm and a physical realm and the two could never meet. Whether or not that's the case, and whether or not you would welcome or regret that shift in human ontology, nonetheless, I think we are beginning to see the emergence of what I called right at the very beginning a neurocomplex, the emergence of multiple claims for neuro-expertise, people managing us in all sorts of ways by acting or believing they're acting on the brains, whether it's in the security apparatuses, whether it's in education, whether it's in child rearing, whether it is in psychiatry itself. And the question then is, how should the social and human sciences respond? Should we just repeat our fear and our anxiety about determinism and reductionism? I don't think that's an adequate response these days. I think something more interesting is going on, and we should not fight the battles of the last century, but engage in the critical thought of our own. In the book that Joël Abirached and I wrote, called Neuro, we argued for a relationship between the social and human sciences and the life sciences, the neurosciences, which we called critical friendship. Critical friendship will accept that much of what makes us human happens way below the level of our consciousness, and that experience is inscribed in the brain itself, but which couples that with a critical analysis of many of the overblown claims to truth that are made by the neuroscientists. So not to give up our critical faculties, but as I say, to try and fight the battles of today rather than the battles of last century. Of course, we need to put the brain back in its body. We need to recognize the extended mind. We need to recognize that no brain acts in isolation, that bodies are in transactions with one another, and we need to place the organism back in its milieu. But I think we can do all that. We can do all that without giving up our thought of the salience of the brain for the way in which we should understand ourselves in the 21st century. And I will just leave you with that little quote, and thank you for your attention.